They say the cruelest wounds are the ones inflicted by the hands that once held you close, and I learned that truth in the most devastating way possible. When the person who shared your mother's womb, who played in the same backyard, who promised to always protect you, becomes the architect of your destruction. There's a special kind of hell that opens up beneath your feet. My name is Janella. I'm 74 years old, and I'm speaking to you today from my quiet little cottage in Savannah, Georgia. But the story I'm about to tell you happened in a world that feels like a lifetime away, when I was young and foolish enough to believe that blood meant loyalty, that family meant safety, and that love could never be weaponized against you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was born in 1951 in a dusty farming town called Millbrook, Nebraska, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, and the closest thing to excitement was the weekly farmers market on Saturdays. My father Robert owned a modest general store that had been in our family for 3 generations, and my mother Helen helped run it while also managing our small farm behind the store. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we had something that money couldn't buy: a tight-knit family that genuinely cared for each other, or so I believed. My brother Marcus was 2 years older than me, born in 1949, and from the very beginning, he was everything I wasn't. Where I was quiet and thoughtful, he was loud and commanding. Where I preferred books and sewing, he gravitated toward machinery and business dealings. Where I sought approval through kindness and hard work, he demanded attention through grand gestures and bold proclamations. But despite our differences, I adored him completely. He was my big brother, my protector, the person I looked up to, more than anyone else in the world. Our childhood in Millbrook was simple, but filled with the kind of memories that warm your heart decades later. Summer mornings started before dawn, helping Papa load the truck with fresh vegetables from our garden to stock the store. Marcus and I would race each other to see who could carry the most crates, and he always let me win, ruffling my hair and calling me his little champion. Mama would pack us thick ham sandwiches and sweet tea in mason jars, and we'd eat lunch, sitting on the store's front porch, watching the occasional car drive through our sleepy town. Papa taught us both the business from an early age, but it was clear that Marcus had a natural talent for it. He could charm customers into buying twice what they came for, had an intuitive understanding of inventory and profit margins, and possessed the kind of confident handshake that made farmers and traveling salesmen alike trust him immediately. I, on the other hand, preferred working in the back room, carefully organizing supplies, mending torn sacks, and keeping the books with meticulous attention to detail. Marcus has the gift of gab, Papa would often say, but Janella has the gift of precision. A business needs both to succeed. Those words made me feel important, valued, like I had a crucial role to play in our family's future. Little did I know that precision and attention to detail would later become the very tools used against me. Our town operated on old-fashioned values where a handshake was better than any contract, where families supported each other through difficult seasons, and where your word was your bond. The Hendersons, who owned the hardware store down the street, had been our friends for generations. The Morettis ran the only restaurant in town, and Mama and Mrs. Moretti exchanged recipes and gossip every Tuesday afternoon. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone looked out for each other. It was the kind of place where you never locked your doors, where children could wander freely without fear, and where the biggest scandal might be someone's prize-winning tomatoes being suspiciously larger than seemed natural. Marcus thrived in this environment. He was popular with the local boys, charming with the girls, and respected by the adults who saw in him a young man destined for success. He played baseball for the high school team, organized community fundraisers, and had a smile that could light up the darkest room. People often told Mama and Papa how lucky they were to have such a fine son, and I never felt jealous because I was proud of him too. He was my brother, and his success felt like my success. When I turned 16, Marcus was already 18 and had graduated from high school with plans to attend the State University in Lincoln to study business administration. The plan was always that he would return to Millbrook after college to take over the family store and farm, expanding both into the thriving enterprise Papa had always dreamed of. I was expected to marry a nice local boy, probably help with the business in some capacity, and raise my children in the same wholesome environment where we had been raised. But I had different dreams. I had discovered a passion for fashion and design, spending hours sketching dress patterns and studying the latest styles in the magazines that occasionally made their way to our little town. I taught myself to sew on Mama's old Singer machine, creating beautiful garments that caught the attention of the local ladies. Mrs. Henderson commissioned me to make her daughter's prom dress, and when other girls saw it, I suddenly found myself with more orders than I could handle. "Janella's got real talent," Mama would boast to her friends. "She could probably make a living doing this in a big city someday." But Papa was less enthusiastic about the idea of his daughter leaving Millbrook. In his mind, a woman's place was with her family, and while he was proud of my skills, he saw them as something to complement a traditional life, not replace it. Marcus, however, seemed supportive of my dreams. He would look at my sketches with genuine admiration, telling me I was too talented to waste away in a small town. "When I take over the business," he would say, "I'll help you set up a proper dressmaking shop. We could even expand into the next county, make it a real enterprise." His encouragement meant everything to me, and I began to envision a future where I could pursue my passion while still being close to family. During Marcus's first year away at university, our correspondence was frequent and affectionate. He wrote long letters describing his classes, his new friends, and his grand plans for modernizing our family business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He talked about incorporating new marketing strategies, expanding our customer base, and even possibly opening a second location in a larger nearby town. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself caught up in his vision of our shared future. It was during his sophomore year that things began to change, though so subtly at first that I didn't recognize the shift. His letters became less frequent and more focused on money. He wrote about expensive textbooks, social events that required proper clothing, and opportunities that needed financial investment. Papa, who had always been frugal but supportive of education, began sending Marcus additional money beyond what they had budgeted for his college expenses. "Education is an investment," Papa would say when Mama worried about the increasing costs. "Marcus is learning things that will benefit all of us in the long run." And I believed that completely. We all did. Marcus was our family's hope for a better future, the one who would elevate us from small-town store owners to successful regional business people. When Marcus came home for Christmas during his sophomore year, I noticed changes in him that went beyond the obvious ones, like his more sophisticated clothing and his newly acquired habit of using business terminology in casual conversation. There was something harder in his eyes, something calculating that I had never seen before. He seemed to view everything and everyone through the lens of potential advantage, including me. "You've really improved with your sewing," he told me one evening as I worked on a dress for Mrs. Moretti's niece. "I've been thinking about how we could monetize that skill more effectively." Monetize. It was a word I had never heard him use before, and it made my creative passion sound somehow cold and mechanical. He began asking detailed questions about my customers, how much I charged, how much profit I made, and how much time each project required. At first, I was happy to share this information because I thought he was genuinely interested in helping me grow my little business. I showed him my carefully kept records, my sketches, my plans for expanding into more sophisticated garments. "You're undercharging," he told me after reviewing my books. "These wealthy farmers' wives would pay twice what you're asking, maybe more, and you're spending too much time on details that they probably don't even notice." His suggestions made business sense, but they somehow missed the point of why I loved creating beautiful things. It wasn't just about money for me. It was about the satisfaction of crafting something perfect, something that made a woman feel beautiful and confident. But Marcus was convincing, and I trusted his business acumen completely. After all, he was studying these things in college, learning from professors who understood markets and profit margins in ways that small-town people like us never could. When he suggested that I start charging more and working faster, I reluctantly agreed, even though it meant compromising on some of the quality details that I took pride in. The changes were gradual, but steady. Marcus convinced me to order cheaper fabrics that looked similar to the expensive ones I had been using, arguing that most customers couldn't tell the difference and that higher profit margins would allow me to expand more quickly. He suggested simplified construction techniques that saved time but resulted in garments that weren't quite as durable or beautifully finished as my previous work. "It's about efficiency," he explained. "You can make 3 dresses in the time it used to take you to make one, and charge almost as much for each one." Initially, the strategy seemed to work. My income increased, and I had more orders than ever before. But I began to notice that customers weren't quite as enthusiastic about my work as they had been previously. Compliments became more polite and less effusive. Repeat customers became less frequent. The joy I had once felt in creating beautiful garments was gradually replaced by the stress of meeting deadlines and maximizing profits. Marcus praised my newfound business success, telling Papa and Mama how proud they should be of their daughter's entrepreneurial spirit. But I felt increasingly hollow about the work that had once brought me such satisfaction. When I tried to express these concerns to Marcus, he dismissed them as the inevitable growing pains of transitioning from a hobby to a real business. "You can't let sentiment interfere with success," he told me. "If you want to compete in the real world, you have to think like a business person, not like an artist." The words stung because they seemed to imply that caring about craftsmanship and customer satisfaction was somehow naive or impractical. During Marcus's junior year, his requests for money became more frequent and more urgent. He wrote about opportunities to invest in business ventures with his classmates, networking events that required expensive dinners, and internships that paid little but offered valuable connections. Papa, who had been dipping into the store's operating budget to support these expenses, began to look worried about our finances. I offered to contribute some of my earnings to help with Marcus's education, an offer that he accepted with gratitude. That seemed genuine at the time. "You're investing in our family's future," he assured me. "When I graduate and come back to expand the business, you'll see returns on this investment that will far exceed what you're giving up now." Looking back, I can see that this was the moment when the trap began to close around me, though I was completely oblivious to it at the time. I was so proud to be able to help my brilliant brother achieve his dreams, so honored that he considered my contribution important to his success. The idea that he might be manipulating my love and trust for his own selfish purposes never crossed my mind. I began working longer hours, taking on more customers, and pushing myself to meet increasingly aggressive deadlines in order to generate more money for Marcus's education. My health began to suffer from the stress and exhaustion, but I told myself it was temporary, that the sacrifice would be worth it when Marcus returned with his degree and we built something amazing together. Mama noticed my deteriorating condition and tried to convince me to slow down, but I brushed off her concerns. "Marcus needs our support," I would tell her. "This is just for a little while longer." Papa, caught between his worry for me and his pride in his son's academic achievements, struggled to know what to say. He had sacrificed so much for Marcus's education that admitting it might be too much felt like admitting failure. The letters from Marcus became increasingly focused on his post-graduation plans, which seemed to grow more grandiose with each communication. He wrote about potential business partnerships he was forming, investors who were interested in funding, expansions and opportunities in larger cities that could provide the kind of growth that Millbrook never could. While these plans sounded exciting, They also began to sound less and less connected to our family's little store and farm. When I asked specific questions about how these grand plans would incorporate our existing business and my dressmaking enterprise, his answers became vague and evasive. He wrote about the need to think bigger and not be limited by small-town thinking, phrases that made me feel somehow inadequate for being content with a simpler life. During his final semester, Marcus announced that he had been offered an incredible opportunity to work with a development company in Omaha that specialized in acquiring and modernizing small-town businesses. The opportunity was too good to pass up, he wrote, and would position him perfectly to eventually return and transform our family enterprise into something much more significant. The plan, as he explained it, made sense on the surface. He would gain valuable experience working with successful business people, learn about modern management techniques and financing options, and build relationships that would benefit our family in the long run. The job would require him to delay his return to Millbrook by a few years, but the knowledge and connections he gained would more than compensate for the delay. Papa was disappointed, but tried to hide it behind pride in his son's success. "If that's what's best for Marcus's career," he said, "then that's what's best for the family." Mama was less convinced, worrying that her son was drifting away from his roots and the values they had tried to instill in him. I was conflicted, excited about Marcus's opportunities, but also feeling abandoned and unsure about what his absence would mean for the future we had planned together. When Marcus came home for his graduation celebration, he was like a different person entirely. Gone was any trace of the small-town boy who had left for college 4 years earlier. In his place was a polished, sophisticated young man who spoke in business jargon and seemed to view our simple family life with something approaching condescension. He was polite and affectionate in his interactions with us, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before, a sense that he was already mentally living in a different world. He spent most of his time during that visit conducting what he called strategic assessments of our business operations. He reviewed our financial records with the intensity of an auditor, asked probing questions about our customer base and market position, and took detailed notes about everything from our inventory management to our property values. At the time, I thought he was simply being thorough in his preparation for eventually taking over the business, but his focus seemed oddly impersonal for someone who was supposed to be coming home. The conversations about my dressmaking business took on a similar analytical tone. Marcus wanted to know exact profit margins, customer retention rates, and growth projections. When I tried to explain that my work was about more than just numbers, that there was value in the relationships I had built with customers and the reputation for quality I had established, he nodded politely, but I could see that he considered these concerns irrelevant to real business planning. "We'll need to scale up significantly if this is going to be a viable component of our expansion plans," he told me. "Small-scale custom work isn't sustainable in a competitive market. We'll need to think about mass production, standardized designs, maybe even outsourcing the actual construction to reduce labor costs." His words made my heart sink because they described something completely different from the work I loved, but I tried to trust his expertise and vision. During his last evening at home before leaving for his new job in Omaha, Marcus sat me down for what he called a serious conversation about our family's future. He spoke about the need for modernization, the importance of thinking beyond traditional small-town limitations, and the opportunities that would become available if we were willing to make some short-term sacrifices for long-term gains. "I need you to trust me, Janella," he said, taking my hands in his in a gesture that reminded me of the protective big brother I had always adored. "The next few years are going to require some difficult decisions and some changes that might not make sense from your perspective, but I need you to believe that everything I'm doing is for the good of our family. Can you do that for me?" Of course I promised that I could. How could I not? He was my brother, the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world, the one who had always looked out for me and encouraged my dreams. If Marcus said that trust was necessary, then trust was what he would have, completely and unconditionally. I had no way of knowing that I had just agreed to my own destruction, that the brother I loved so deeply had already begun to view me not as family to be protected, but as a resource to be exploited. The trap had been set with such care and subtlety that I walked into it willingly, eagerly, grateful for the opportunity to prove my loyalty to someone who had already decided that my welfare was less important than his ambition. The real betrayal was about to begin, and I was completely unprepared for the devastating lesson I was about to learn about the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and calculated exploitation. But that part of my story, the part that nearly destroyed everything I thought I knew about myself and the world, would have to wait for tomorrow's telling. Because some wounds are so deep that they require their own time and space to be properly understood. Marcus left for Omaha on a humid Tuesday morning in June 1973, his car packed with expensive luggage and business suits that looked foreign against the backdrop of our simple farm. I watched him drive away with a mixture of pride and loneliness, believing wholeheartedly that his success would eventually become our family's success. Papa stood beside me on the porch, his weathered hands gripping the railing as we watched the dust settle on the gravel road where Marcus had disappeared. Around the bend. "He'll do well for himself," Papa said quietly. But I could hear the uncertainty beneath his confident words. "And when he's ready, he'll come back and make something special out of what we've built here." I nodded, squeezing Papa's arm, both of us trying to convince ourselves that the distance growing between Marcus and our family was temporary, necessary, part of a larger plan that would ultimately bring us all closer together. The first few months after Marcus's departure passed quietly in Millbrook. Without his dynamic presence and grand plans constantly stirring up excitement about the future, life settled back into the peaceful rhythms that had defined our town for generations. Papa threw himself into the daily operations of the store with renewed focus, and I found myself gradually returning to the style of dressmaking that had originally brought me joy, taking more time with each piece and focusing on quality over quantity. Mrs. Anderson, who owned the boarding house on Main Street, commissioned me to make new curtains for all her guest rooms, and the project allowed me to experiment with different fabrics and patterns in a way that felt creative rather than purely commercial. The work was satisfying in a way that my recent rush orders had not been, and I began to remember why I had fallen in love with sewing in the first place. The careful selection of materials, the precise cutting and stitching, the gradual emergence of something beautiful from simple cloth. These were the aspects of my craft that fed my soul rather than just my bank account. It was during this period of rediscovering my passion that I met David Mitchell, a carpenter who had come to Millbrook to help build the new addition to the Methodist church. He was 24 to my 22, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and kind brown eyes that seemed to see something special in everyone he met. David was the sort of man who could fix anything that was broken, who spoke softly but commanded respect through his competence and integrity, who made me feel valued not for what I could do for him, but simply for who I was. Our courtship began when Reverend Thompson asked me to make new altar cloths for the church, and I needed to coordinate with David about the dimensions and placement of the communion table he was crafting. What should have been a brief business conversation stretched into an afternoon of easy conversation about everything from woodworking techniques to our shared love of reading. David had a quiet intelligence that reminded me of Papa, but there was also a gentleness about him that made me feel safe in a way I had never experienced with any other man. Unlike the boys I had known in high school, who seemed to view women as either decorative objects or domestic servants, David treated me as an equal partner in our conversations. He asked thoughtful questions about my sewing business, genuinely interested in the creative and technical aspects of my work. When I showed him some of my dress designs, he studied them with the same careful attention he gave to his carpentry blueprints, making observations about proportion and construction that revealed his artist's eye. "You have a real gift," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch swing at my parents' house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, not just for making things beautiful, but for understanding what makes people feel good about themselves. That's rarer than you might think. His words meant more to me than all of Marcus's business advice had, because they acknowledged the heart behind my work rather than just its profit potential. David's own story was one of quiet determination and steady progress. He had grown up on a farm outside Lincoln, the youngest of 4 brothers, and had learned carpentry from his grandfather, who believed that a man should be able to create with his hands as well as provide with his labor. After completing his apprenticeship, David had spent several years traveling throughout Nebraska and Iowa, working on different projects and honing his skills while saving money to eventually start his own construction business. What impressed me most about David was his approach to his work. He took on projects not just for the money they would bring, but because they allowed him to create something lasting and beautiful. The church addition, for example, paid well enough, but David had also insisted on using higher quality materials and more detailed craftsmanship than the congregation had budgeted for, absorbing the extra cost himself because he wanted to give back to the community that had welcomed him. "A man's work should reflect his character," he told me when I asked why he was willing to sacrifice profit for perfection. "If I'm going to put my name on something, I want it to be something I'm proud of for the rest of my life." This philosophy resonated deeply with me, as it echoed my own feelings about the dresses and garments I created. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally over the course of that autumn. David would stop by the store in the evenings after finishing his work at the church, ostensibly to buy supplies or check on special orders, but really to spend time talking with me while I worked on my sewing projects. Papa approved of him immediately, appreciating his work ethic and respectful manner, while Mama was charmed by his habit of bringing her wildflowers he had picked on his way into town. As winter approached and David's work on the church neared completion, we both began to face the reality that he would soon need to move on to his next project, which would take him to another town, possibly hundreds of miles away. The prospect of his departure filled me with a sadness that surprised me with its intensity. In just a few short months, David had become not just a romantic interest, but a trusted friend and confidant, someone whose presence had enriched my daily life in ways I was only beginning to understand. It was during this uncertain time that I received a letter from Marcus that would change the trajectory of my life in ways I could never have imagined. The letter arrived on a cold December morning, the envelope bearing the letterhead of Morrison, Development Company, and Marcus's familiar handwriting. I opened it eagerly, hungry for news from my brother after weeks of minimal communication. The letter was longer and more detailed than his recent correspondence had been, filled with enthusiasm about his work and excitement about opportunities he was discovering in the commercial development field. He wrote about shopping centers being built in growing suburbs, about the potential for small-town businesses to expand into regional chains, about investment strategies that could transform modest family enterprises into significant commercial ventures. But it was the final pages of the letter that made my heart race with excitement and possibility. Marcus had been discussing our family's situation with his colleagues and supervisors, and they had expressed interest in potentially partnering with us on a development project that could benefit everyone involved. The details were complex, involving land acquisition, commercial construction, and business expansion. But the basic concept was that Morrison Development would provide the capital and expertise to help us transform our simple general store into the anchor tenant of a modern shopping complex. "This could be exactly what our family needs," Marcus wrote. "Instead of just running a small-town store that barely breaks even, we could become partners in a major development project that would provide financial security for all of us for generations to come. The company is particularly interested in working with established local businesses that have good reputations and strong community ties, which describes our situation perfectly." The proposal, as Marcus outlined it, seemed almost too good to be true. Morrison Development would purchase the land where our store currently stood, along with several adjacent properties, and construct a modern retail complex anchored by an expanded version of our general store. Papa would retain ownership of the store itself while also receiving a significant payment for the land, plus ongoing rental income from other businesses in the complex. The arrangement would provide immediate financial benefits while also positioning our family business for long-term growth and prosperity. What made the proposal even more attractive was Marcus's assurance that I would have an important role in the expanded operation. The new complex would include space for a professional dressmaking and alterations shop, which I could operate with the backing and marketing support of a major development company. Instead of working alone out of our back room, I would have a proper storefront, professional equipment, and access to customers from throughout the region. "This is your chance to take your talents to the next level, Janella," Marcus wrote. "Instead of making a few dresses for local farmers' wives, you could be running a real business that serves customers from 3 counties. The income potential is enormous, and you'd have the security of being part of a professionally managed commercial development." I read and reread the letter until I had memorized every word, my excitement growing with each review. This seemed like the answer to dreams I had never dared to articulate, the perfect combination of financial opportunity and creative fulfillment. More importantly, it represented the realization of the partnership with Marcus that I had always hoped for, proof that his education and business acumen could indeed benefit our entire family. When I showed the letter to Papa, his reaction was more cautious than mine had been. He studied the details carefully, asking questions about aspects of the proposal that I had glossed over in my enthusiasm. What exactly would happen to our current customers during the transition period? How much control would we retain over the day-to-day operations of our store? What guarantees did we have that Morrison Development would follow through on their commitments once they owned the land? "It sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Papa said diplomatically. "But it's also a very big change. We'd be giving up a lot of control over our own business, and once we sell the land, there's no going back if things don't work out as planned." His concerns were valid, but they seemed overly conservative to me at the time. Here was a chance to transform our modest family business into something significant, and Papa was worried about hypothetical problems instead of focusing on the tremendous potential benefits. Mama's reaction was even more skeptical than Papa's. She had always been protective of our family's independence and suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. "Why would some big company from Omaha be interested in our little store?" she asked. "What aren't they telling us about this deal?" Her questions irritated me because they seemed to be based on fear rather than logic, but I couldn't answer them satisfactorily because Marcus's letter had focused more on the benefits than on the specific mechanics of the partnership. It was David who helped me think through the proposal more objectively. When I shared Marcus's letter with him, he read it with the same careful attention he gave to construction blueprints, asking practical questions about timelines, financial arrangements, and legal protections. His background in construction gave him insights into development projects that I lacked, and some of his observations were troubling. "Development companies usually don't partner with existing businesses," he told me gently. "They typically buy out the current owners and bring in their own tenants who can pay higher rents. If they're willing to let your family keep the store, it suggests that they're getting something very valuable in return, probably more valuable than what you're being offered." His words made sense, but they also threatened the beautiful future I had begun to imagine for myself and my family. David's concerns were compounded when he made some inquiries about Morrison Development through his network of construction contacts. What he learned was not entirely reassuring. The company had a reputation for aggressive acquisition strategies and for making promises to local business owners that were not always honored once contracts were signed. Several small-town merchants in Iowa had complained about being misled by Morrison representatives who painted rosy pictures of partnership opportunities that turned out to be buyout strategies in disguise. "I'm not saying your brother is trying, To deceive you, David said carefully. But it's possible that he's being misled himself, or that he doesn't fully understand the implications of what he's proposing. These big development companies are very good at making deals sound better than they actually are, especially to people who don't have experience with commercial real estate transactions. His words planted seeds of doubt that I tried to ignore, but they also forced me to confront some uncomfortable questions about Marcus's motivations and level of expertise. My brother was intelligent and well-educated, but he was also young and eager to prove himself in his new career. Was it possible that his enthusiasm for this opportunity was clouding his judgment about its potential risks to our family? Despite these concerns, I found myself increasingly drawn to the possibilities that Marcus's proposal represented. The idea of expanding my dressmaking business beyond the limitations of small-town clientele was intoxicating, and the promise of financial security for our family was deeply appealing. Papa and Mama had worked so hard for so many years with relatively little to show for their efforts beyond the satisfaction of serving their community. This could be their chance to enjoy some real prosperity in their later years. When I wrote back to Marcus, I tried to balance enthusiasm with caution, expressing interest in the proposal while also raising some of the questions that Papa and David had posed. I asked for more specific details about the financial arrangements, the timeline for development, and the guarantees that would protect our family's interests throughout the process. I also mentioned David and his construction background, suggesting that his expertise might be valuable in evaluating the technical aspects of the development plan. Marcus's response came within a week, and it was even more enthusiastic than his original letter had been. He assured me that all of our concerns could be addressed through proper legal documentation and that Morrison Development was committed to maintaining positive relationships with their local partners. He also expressed interest in potentially involving David in the construction phase of the project, which could provide additional income opportunities for both of us. This is exactly the kind of thinking that will make this partnership successful, Marcus wrote. You're asking all the right questions and thinking about all the important details. Morrison Development is impressed by our family's business acumen, and they're even more convinced that this partnership will be mutually beneficial. They've asked me to extend a formal invitation for you and Papa to visit their offices in Omaha, so you can see some of their other projects and meet with the senior partners who would be overseeing our development. The invitation to visit Omaha felt like validation of our importance to the project and an opportunity to get answers to our remaining questions. Papa was initially reluctant to make the trip, worried about leaving the store unattended and uncomfortable with the idea of traveling to the big city for business meetings. But I convinced him that we owed it to ourselves and to Marcus to at least explore the opportunity thoroughly before making any decisions. David offered to accompany us to Omaha, both to provide moral support and to offer his professional perspective on the development plans. His presence would make me feel more confident about navigating what would undoubtedly be a complex business discussion, and his construction expertise might help us understand technical aspects of the proposal that we might otherwise miss. The trip to Omaha was scheduled for a cold February morning in 1974, just over a year since Marcus had left Millbrook to pursue his career in the big city. As we prepared for the journey, I found myself oscillating between excitement and nervousness about what we might discover. This could be the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story, one that would provide opportunities and security, beyond anything we had previously imagined. Or it could be the first step down a path that would ultimately lead us away from everything we valued about our simple, honest life in Millbrook. What I didn't know, couldn't have known at that time, was that Marcus had already made decisions that would determine the outcome of our visit before we even left Nebraska. The brother I trusted completely had been working behind the scenes to ensure that this opportunity would benefit him far more than it would benefit the family he claimed to be helping. The trap that had been set so carefully was about to spring, closed, and I was walking into it willingly, gratefully, completely unaware that my own love and trust were being used as weapons against me. The foundation for everything that would follow was being laid during those cold February days, when hope felt more real than fear, and when family loyalty seemed like the most important value in the world. Soon I would learn how dangerous it can be to trust someone simply because they share your blood, and how devastating it feels when the person you love most in the world reveals that your welfare has never been as important to them as their own ambition. But for now, in those last days before the truth began to reveal itself, I allowed myself to dream about the future that Marcus had painted for us. I imagined my beautiful dressmaking shop filled with elegant fabrics and satisfied customers, Papa and Mama enjoying the financial security they had earned through decades of hard work, and our family united in a successful business venture that honored both our traditional values and our modern aspirations. It was a beautiful dream, and I held on to it tightly, having no idea how much it would hurt when reality finally forced me to let it go. The Morrison development offices in Omaha were everything I had expected from a successful business enterprise. Located in a gleaming downtown building that stretched toward the gray February sky, the company occupied an entire floor filled with modern furniture, impressive artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the bustling city below. As Papa, David, and I stepped off the elevator into the polished reception area, I felt simultaneously intimidated and thrilled to be part of something so obviously prosperous and professional. Marcus met us in the lobby, and I was struck again by how much he had changed since leaving Millbrook. His expensive suit, confident handshake, and easy familiarity with the sophisticated surroundings made him seem like a different person entirely from the farm boy who had grown up feeding chickens and stocking shelves in our family store. He embraced me warmly, shook hands enthusiastically with Papa and David, and immediately began pointing out features of the office that he thought would impress us. "This is just one of 3 floors that Morrison Development occupies in this building," he told us proudly as he led us through corridors lined with architectural drawings and photographs of completed projects. "The company has been growing so rapidly that they're already planning to expand into additional space next year. That's the kind of success and stability you want in a business partner." The presentation that followed was masterfully orchestrated to address every concern we had raised and to paint an even more attractive picture of the partnership opportunity than Marcus's letters had suggested. Senior executives spoke knowledgeably about market trends in rural retail development, showed us detailed financial projections that demonstrated the profitability of similar projects, and presented architectural renderings of what our expanded store complex might look like. The numbers were indeed impressive. According to their calculations, our family's annual income from the store and my dressmaking business could increase by more than 300% within the first 5 years of the partnership. The land sale would provide immediate capital that could be invested for additional long-term returns, while the ongoing rental income from other businesses in the complex would provide a steady stream of revenue that could support our family for generations. Mr. Richardson, the senior vice president who seemed to be leading the presentation, was particularly persuasive when discussing the benefits the project would bring to Millbrook itself. The retail complex would create dozens of new jobs for local residents, attract customers from surrounding communities, and generally stimulate economic growth throughout our region. Rather than being just another development company extracting value from small towns, Morrison was positioned as a partner committed to strengthening rural communities through thoughtful commercial development. "We're not interested in coming into established communities and disrupting what works," Mr. Richardson explained earnestly. "Our most successful projects are those where we can build upon existing strengths and relationships. Your family's reputation in Millbrook, combined with our capital and expertise, creates exactly the kind of foundation that leads to sustainable growth and mutual prosperity." The tour of other Morrison development projects was equally impressive. We visited a shopping complex in a town similar to Millbrook, where a former hardware store owner showed us through his expanded operation, now occupying 5 times as much space and serving customers from throughout the region. The owner, Mr. Patterson, spoke enthusiastically about his partnership with Morrison, describing how the company had helped him modernize his inventory systems, expand his product lines, and increase his profits beyond anything he had thought possible. "I was skeptical at first," Mr. Patterson admitted as he walked us through his spacious, well-organized store. "Like most small-town business owners, I was worried about losing control and independence. But Morrison has been nothing but supportive. They provide the resources and expertise, but they respect my knowledge of the local market and my relationships with customers. It's been the best business decision I ever made." What impressed me most about Mr. Patterson's operation was how he had managed to maintain the personal touch that customers valued, while also achieving the efficiency and profitability that modern retail demanded. His employees seemed happy and well-trained. His customers appeared satisfied and loyal, and the store itself was a perfect blend of small-town friendliness and big-city sophistication. During our lunch at an elegant downtown restaurant, the Morrison executives continued to reinforce their commitment to our success and their understanding of our concerns. They acknowledged that family businesses often worried about losing their identity when partnering with larger companies, and they provided examples of how they had successfully preserved the character and values of their small-town partners while helping them achieve dramatic growth. "The key to successful partnerships," explained Ms. Carter, the company's director of rural development, "is recognizing that local business owners bring irreplaceable assets to the table. You understand your community, your customers, and your market in ways that we never could. Our role is to provide the capital, expertise, and resources that allow you to leverage those assets more effectively, not to replace them with some generic corporate approach." It was during this lunch conversation that I first began to notice subtle inconsistencies in what the Morrison executives were telling us. While they spoke eloquently about preserving local character and maintaining family control, some of their specific comments suggested a more standardized approach to business operations than their general rhetoric implied. When I asked about how much input we would have in selecting other tenants for the retail complex, the answer was somewhat evasive, focusing on their expertise in tenant selection rather than our role in the process. Similarly, when Papa asked about what would happen if we wanted to make changes to our store operations or inventory selection, the response emphasized the importance of maintaining consistency with proven business models rather than the flexibility to adapt to local preferences. These weren't necessarily contradictions, but they suggested that the partnership might involve more corporate oversight and less family autonomy than the initial presentations had implied. David, who had been listening carefully throughout the day, asked several pointed questions about the construction timeline, material specifications, and quality control measures that would govern the development project. His queries revealed some concerning gaps in the planning that the Morrison executives seemed reluctant to address directly. When he asked about provisions for cost overruns or delays in construction, the answers were vague and seemed to place most of the financial risk on the local partners rather than on Morrison Development. "In our experience," Mr. Richardson explained when pressed about these issues, "unforeseen complications are rare when projects are properly planned and managed. We've completed dozens of similar developments without significant problems, so we're confident that this project will proceed smoothly and on schedule." His confidence was reassuring, but it didn't actually answer David's questions about what would happen if problems did arise. Despite these minor concerns, the overall impression from our day in Omaha was overwhelmingly positive. The Morrison executives seemed competent, experienced, and genuinely committed to our success. The financial projections were supported by detailed analysis and comparable examples from similar projects. The architectural plans were attractive and appropriate for our community. Most importantly, Marcus's enthusiasm and obvious success with the company provided personal validation that this was indeed the opportunity he had represented it to be. On the drive back to Millbrook, Papa David and I discussed what we had learned and what our next steps should be. Papa was clearly impressed by the professionalism and resources of Morrison Development, though he remained concerned about some of the practical details that hadn't been fully addressed. David's construction expertise had identified several technical issues that would need to be resolved, but nothing that seemed insurmountable with proper planning and communication. For my part, I was captivated by the vision of what my dressmaking business could become with Morrison's backing and resources. The opportunity to serve customers from throughout the region, to work with higher quality materials and equipment, and to establish myself as a serious professional rather than just a small-town seamstress was incredibly appealing. The financial projections suggested that I could earn more in 1 year than I currently made in 3 or 4, while also building something that could provide security for my future family. It was during this drive home that I made what I now recognize as one of the most critical mistakes of my life. Swept up in the excitement of the opportunity and influenced by Marcus's obvious success and confidence, I encouraged Papa to move forward with the partnership despite the unresolved questions and concerns that David had raised. I argued that the potential benefits far outweighed the risks, and that we would be foolish to let such an extraordinary opportunity pass us by simply because of minor uncertainties that could probably be resolved through proper legal documentation. Marcus wouldn't be recommending this if he didn't believe it was good for our family, I told Papa earnestly. He's learned so much about business since he's been with Morrison, and he's in a position to see opportunities that we might miss. From our limited perspective, we need to trust his judgment and his commitment to our welfare. Papa's love for his children and his respect for Marcus's education ultimately overcame his natural caution. "If this is what you and Marcus think is best for the family," he said quietly, "then we'll move forward. But I want to make sure we have good legal representation and that every detail is properly documented before we sign anything." The legal review process that followed should have revealed the problems that were embedded in Morrison Development's proposal, but it didn't, largely because we made the mistake of accepting Marcus's recommendation for an attorney rather than finding our own independent counsel. The lawyer he suggested, Mr. Williams, was pleasant, knowledgeable, and reassuring about the basic soundness of the partnership agreement. He explained the key provisions in terms that seemed straightforward and fair, and he assured us that our interests were properly protected through various safeguards and guarantees. What I didn't know at the time was that Mr. Williams had a long-standing relationship with Morrison Development and had represented the company in numerous previous transactions. While he wasn't technically acting unethically by also representing us, his familiarity and comfort with Morrison's standard practices meant that he was less likely to identify potential problems or to push for modifications that might better protect our interests. The legal documents were indeed comprehensive and professionally prepared, but they were also extremely complex and filled with technical language that was difficult for non-lawyers to fully understand. Mr. Williams' explanations focused on the major provisions and benefits while glossing over many of the detailed clauses that would ultimately prove most important to our family's welfare. One particularly significant provision that wasn't adequately explained concerned the conditions under which Morrison Development could modify or terminate the partnership agreement. While the basic terms seemed to provide strong protections for our continued involvement in the retail complex, there were numerous exceptions and contingencies that could potentially be invoked if circumstances changed or if our performance didn't meet certain standards. Another problematic area involved the valuation and payment terms for our land. While the base price was generous and clearly stated, there were various adjustments and contingencies that could affect the final amount we received. Some of these adjustments were tied to factors beyond our control, such as soil conditions, environmental assessments, and municipal approval processes that could take months or years to complete. Perhaps most importantly, the agreement contained provisions that would give Morrison Development significant control over our day-to-day business operations once the partnership was formalized. While this was presented as necessary coordination to ensure the success of the overall retail complex, the practical effect would be to limit our autonomy in ways that weren't immediately obvious from the general descriptions we had been given. Marcus was present for most of the legal review meetings, and his presence provided additional reassurance that our interests were being properly protected. He asked intelligent questions, offered helpful clarifications about Morrison's intentions and practices, and generally reinforced our confidence that we were making a sound business decision. His obvious familiarity with the legal language and business concepts involved made him seem like a valuable advocate for our family's position. What I failed to recognize at the time was that Marcus's loyalties had already shifted away from our family's interests and toward his own career advancement with Morrison Development. The enthusiasm and advocacy he displayed during the legal review process weren't motivated by genuine concern for our welfare, but by his desire to complete a transaction that would enhance his standing with his employers and demonstrate his ability to bring profitable deals to the company. The signing ceremony took place on a bright April morning in 1974 in the conference room of Morrison Development's Omaha offices. Papa wore his best suit, the same one he had been married in 25 years earlier, and I had made myself a new dress specifically for the occasion, wanting to look professional and successful for this momentous step in our family's business evolution. Mr. Richardson and the other Morrison executives were gracious and celebratory, speaking about their excitement for the partnership and their confidence in our mutual success. Marcus beamed with pride as he watched Papa and me sign the numerous documents that would transfer ownership of our land to Morrison while establishing our roles as partners in the new retail development. The initial payment we received was indeed substantial, more money than our family had ever possessed at one time. Papa deposited it carefully in the bank, already making plans for how the funds could be invested to provide additional security for our future. I began sketching designs for my new dressmaking shop, imagining the beautiful space I would create with proper lighting, professional equipment, and room to display my work attractively. For several weeks after the signing, everything proceeded exactly as Morrison had promised. Surveying crews arrived in Millbrook to begin the technical planning for the retail complex. Architectural drawings were refined based on site conditions and local requirements. Municipal approvals were sought and obtained with surprising efficiency. The local newspaper ran a positive article about the coming development, praising our family's entrepreneurial spirit and Morrison Development's commitment to rural economic growth. It was during this honeymoon period that I married David in a simple ceremony at the Methodist Church where we had first met. Marcus served as best man, giving a touching speech about family, loyalty, and the importance of building a life with someone who shared your values and dreams. David's work on the church addition had been completed months earlier, but he had decided to stay in Millbrook to be near me, finding enough local construction projects to support himself while we planned our future together. Our wedding was a joyful celebration that seemed to represent everything good about small-town life. The entire community turned out to wish us well, bringing covered dishes for the reception and heartfelt advice for our marriage. Mama cried happy tears as she danced with Papa, and even David's usually stoic parents seemed genuinely pleased to welcome me into their family. The day felt like a perfect beginning to what I was certain would be a wonderful life. David and I. I honeymooned for a week at a cabin on Lake McConaughey, spending lazy days fishing and talking about our plans for the future. We discussed where we would live once my new dressmaking shop was operational, how we might eventually start a family, and what role David might play in the construction and ongoing operations of the retail complex. Everything seemed to be falling into place exactly as we had hoped, and I felt grateful for the extraordinary string of good fortune that had brought us to this point. It was when we returned from our honeymoon that the first real problems began to emerge. Marcus had left several urgent messages asking me to call him immediately about important developments with the Morrison project. When I finally reached him, his voice carried a tension that I had never heard before, and his explanations about the supposed complications were confusing and contradictory. According to Marcus, the surveying work had revealed unexpected complications, with the soil conditions on our property that would require additional environmental testing and possibly remediation work before construction could begin. This wasn't necessarily a major problem, he assured me. but it would delay the project timeline and potentially affect some of the financial arrangements we had agreed to. More troubling was his explanation about changes in Morrison Development's financing situation that might require modifications to our partnership agreement. Apparently, one of their major investors had withdrawn from another project, creating a cash flow situation that affected their ability to proceed with several developments on the original schedule. Again, Marcus emphasized that this was a temporary setback that could be resolved with some patience and flexibility on our part. The important thing, Marcus told me, is that Morrison is still completely committed to our project. They've just asked for some modifications to the payment schedule and construction timeline that will allow them to manage their resources more effectively. It's actually a sign of their professionalism that they're addressing these issues proactively rather than letting them become bigger problems later. When I pressed him for more specific details about what these modifications would mean for our family, his answers became evasive and confusing. The changes seemed to involve delaying some of the payments we were supposed to receive, while also requiring us to assume responsibility for certain costs that had originally been Morrison's obligation. The new timeline would push the opening of the retail complex back by at least a year, possibly more, depending on how quickly the various complications could be resolved. David's reaction to this news was immediately skeptical. His construction experience had taught him that when developers started talking about soil problems and financing difficulties, it usually meant that the project was in serious trouble and that the local partners would be the ones who suffered the consequences. He insisted that we needed to have the new proposed modifications reviewed by an independent attorney rather than relying on Mr. Williams, who had already proven his loyalty to Morrison's interests. Papa was devastated by the news, not just because of the delays and complications, but because of what they suggested about the reliability of the people we had trusted with our family's future. He had built his entire life on the principle that a person's word was their bond, and the idea that Morrison might not honor their commitments was profoundly disturbing to him. The stress of the situation began to affect his health, and I noticed that he was sleeping poorly and losing weight. My own reaction was a mixture of disappointment, confusion, and growing anger. I had given up my established dressmaking business and my comfortable routine to pursue this partnership opportunity, and now it seemed that everything we had been promised might have been built on false premises. Worse, I was beginning to suspect that Marcus might have known about these problems before we signed the partnership agreement, and that his enthusiastic advocacy had been based on incomplete or misleading information. When I confronted Marcus directly about my suspicions, his response was defensive and patronizing in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of his attitude during his college years. He accused me of being paranoid and unrealistic about the normal complications that arise in complex business transactions. He suggested that my lack of experience with commercial development was causing me to overreact to problems that seasoned business people knew how to handle routinely. This is exactly why Morrison wanted to work with local partners who had established relationships and community ties, he told me impatiently. They knew that there would be challenges that required patience and understanding from people who were committed to the long-term success of the project. If you start creating problems and making unreasonable demands every time there's a minor setback, you'll prove that they made a mistake in choosing our family as partners. His words stung because they implied that any concerns or questions I raised were evidence of my inadequacy as a business partner, rather than legitimate responses to Morrison's failure to meet their commitments. The conversation marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in my relationship with Marcus, as I began to realize that his loyalty to Morrison Development might be stronger than his commitment to our family's welfare. The independent legal review that David insisted upon confirmed our worst fears about the proposed modifications to our partnership agreement. The new terms would significantly reduce our financial benefits from the project while increasing our responsibilities and liabilities. Most troubling, the modifications included provisions that would allow Morrison to terminate the partnership entirely if certain performance standards weren't met, standards that were vaguely defined and largely under Morrison's control. Our new attorney, Ms. Henderson, was blunt about the implications of what Morrison was proposing. "These modifications fundamentally change the nature of your agreement," she told us. "Instead of being equal partners in a development project, you would essentially become tenants with some profit-sharing arrangements. Morrison would retain control over all major decisions, while you would bear most of the risks if the project doesn't succeed as planned." The most devastating revelation came when Ms. Henderson's investigation revealed that Morrison Development had a pattern of using exactly these kinds of modifications to gradually squeeze local partners out of profitable projects. Several other small-town business owners had signed similar agreements, only to find themselves forced out entirely when they couldn't meet increasingly stringent performance requirements or afford the additional costs that Morrison imposed through successive contract modifications. When I shared these findings with Marcus, expecting him to be as outraged as I was about Morrison's deceptive practices, his reaction was shocking and heartbreaking. Instead of expressing concern about how our family was being manipulated, he became angry with me for questioning the integrity of his employer and suggested that I was being influenced by a lawyer who didn't understand the development business. "Ms. Henderson is just trying to justify her fees by creating problems where none exist," he told me dismissively. "Morrison Development is a reputable company with an excellent track record. If you can't trust the people I work with every day, then maybe you don't trust my judgment either." It was during this conversation that I first began to understand the terrible truth about what had happened to my relationship with Marcus. Somewhere during his time with Morrison Development, my brother had stopped thinking of himself as a member of our family first and an employee second. His identity and his loyalties had shifted so completely that he was now willing to defend Morrison's interests even when they directly conflicted with our family's welfare. The realization that Marcus had betrayed us was devastating enough. But what made it truly unbearable was the growing evidence that his betrayal had been deliberate and calculated, rather than the result of innocent misjudgment or misplaced loyalty. As I reviewed our conversations and correspondence from the past year, I began to see patterns that suggested he had known from the beginning that Morrison's offers were too good to be true, and that our family would ultimately be the ones to suffer when the reality became clear. The trap that had been set for us was closing, and the person I had trusted most in the world was the one pulling the strings. The complete collapse of everything I thought I knew about my brother began on a rainy Thursday morning in October, 1974, when I received a phone call that would shatter not just my business dreams, but my faith in family itself. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Patterson, the wife of the hardware store owner we had met during our tour of Morrison Development projects. Her words came out in a rush of panic and desperation that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I got your number from the Morrison offices," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "I had to warn you about what's happening to us, what Morrison is doing to my husband's business. They're destroying everything we worked for, and I can't bear the thought of the same thing happening to another family." What Mrs. Patterson told me over the next hour was a nightmare that made all of my previous concerns about Morrison Development seem naive and insignificant. The thriving business partnership that had been showcased to us as a model of successful development was actually in the final stages of complete dissolution. Morrison had been systematically increasing Mr. Patterson's operational costs, imposing new requirements that were impossible to meet, and finding technical violations of their partnership agreement that justified reducing his profit-sharing percentages. "They've been planning this from the beginning," Mrs. Patterson sobbed into the phone. "My husband found documents that prove they never intended to honor the long-term partnership arrangement. The whole point was to get established local businesses to sign over their property and customer base, then find ways to push them out once Morrison had what they needed. We're losing everything, Mrs. Mitchell. Our store, our home, our entire life savings." The details she provided were horrifyingly specific and obviously well documented. Morrison had used a series of seemingly reasonable business modifications to gradually shift all the financial risks onto the Patterson family, while retaining all the profitable aspects of the operation for themselves. When the Pattersons tried to challenge these changes through legal action, they discovered that their original attorney had conflicts of interest that prevented him from representing them effectively, and they couldn't afford to hire new counsel capable of fighting a well-funded corporation. Most devastating of all was Mrs. Patterson's revelation about the role that Morrison employees played in facilitating these betrayals. According to her, young executives like Marcus were specifically assigned to cultivate relationships with potential local partners, using their personal connections and family ties to overcome the natural skepticism that small-town business owners might have about big-city developers. "Your brother came to visit us several times during the early stages of our partnership," Mrs. Patterson told me. "He was so charming and convincing, always talking about how Morrison valued family businesses and wanted to preserve what made small towns special. We trusted him because he seemed like one of us, someone who understood our values and our concerns. Now I realize that everything he told us was carefully scripted to make us feel comfortable about signing away our rights." When I hung up the phone, I felt physically sick with a combination of fear, rage, and disbelief. The woman's story was so detailed and specific that I couldn't dismiss it as the complaints of a disgruntled business partner. Yet it was so horrifying that I couldn't bear to accept what it implied about Marcus's role in our own situation. I tried to convince myself that our circumstances were different, that Marcus would never knowingly participate in the destruction of his own family, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. David found me sitting at the kitchen table, hours later, staring at the notes I had taken during Mrs. Patterson's call. When I told him what I had learned, his face went pale with anger and determination. He immediately began making phone calls to other Morrison development partners, using his network of construction contacts to identify people who might have first-hand experience with the company's business practices. What David discovered over the next few days confirmed our worst fears about Morrison's methods and Marcus's complicity in them. Every single local business owner who had entered into partnerships with Morrison had experienced some version of the same systematic exploitation that Mrs. Patterson had described. The details varied from case to case, but the overall pattern was unmistakable. Morrison would use their local employees' family connections to identify profitable small-town businesses, convince the owners to sign partnership agreements through false promises and misleading projections, then gradually squeeze them out once Morrison had gained control of their prime real estate and established customer relationships. The most heartbreaking aspect of these conversations was learning how many families had been destroyed by Morrison's predatory practices. Children had lost their inheritance, elderly parents had been forced to spend their final years in poverty, and multi-generational businesses had been dissolved to feed the profits of a corporation that viewed small-town communities as nothing more than resources to be exploited. When I confronted Marcus with this information during a phone call that I knew would probably be our last real conversation as brother and sister, his response revealed the complete transformation of the person I had once loved and trusted above all others. Instead of expressing shock or concern about what Morrison was doing to innocent families, he became defensive and angry that I was questioning his employer's integrity. "You're listening to a bunch of failed business owners who can't accept responsibility for their own poor decisions," he told me coldly. "Morrison Development is a legitimate company that provides real opportunities for growth and prosperity. If some people can't handle the demands of operating in a competitive business environment, that's not Morrison's fault." His willingness to dismiss the suffering of families like the Pattersons as their own failure was shocking enough. But what came next was even worse. When I asked him directly whether he had known about Morrison's true intentions when he encouraged our family to sign the partnership agreement, his answer was a masterpiece of evasion and manipulation. "I told you from the beginning that partnerships involve risks and require adaptability," he said. "If you thought you could sign a contract and then never have to deal with changing circumstances or new requirements, then you misunderstood the nature of commercial development. Morrison has been completely transparent about their expectations and standards. The conversation continued for almost an hour, with Marcus becoming increasingly aggressive and condescending as I pressed him for honest answers about his role in Morrison's exploitation of our family. He accused me of being naive about business, ungrateful for the opportunities he had provided, and influenced by David's jealousy of his success. By the end of the call, it was clear that the brother I had loved and admired no longer existed, replaced by someone who would sacrifice his own family's welfare to advance his career with a predatory corporation. The legal battle that followed was brutal and expensive, draining our family's resources while achieving very little in terms of actual protection from Morrison's increasingly aggressive tactics. Ms. Henderson fought valiantly on our behalf, but she was vastly outgunned by Morrison's team of corporate attorneys, who specialized in defending against exactly the kinds of challenges we were raising. Morrison's strategy was to tie us up in legal proceedings while simultaneously implementing the contract modifications that would gradually strip away our rights and benefits. Every motion we filed was met with counter-motions that required additional legal research and court appearances. Every attempt we made to challenge specific provisions of our agreement was answered with threats of additional penalties and complications that would make our situation even worse. Meanwhile, the practical effects of Morrison's betrayal were becoming impossible to ignore. The construction timeline for our retail complex was pushed back repeatedly, always with explanations about regulatory delays or technical complications that were supposedly beyond Morrison's control. The promised payments to our family were reduced or delayed through various contractual mechanisms that our original attorney had failed to adequately protect against. Most devastating of all, my established dressmaking business never recovered from the disruption caused by Morrison's false promises. Many of my longtime customers had made alternative arrangements when I told them about my plans to expand, and they were reluctant to return when it became clear that the expansion might never happen. The reputation for reliability and quality that I had spent years building was damaged by the uncertainty and confusion surrounding my business plans. Papa's health deteriorated rapidly under the stress of watching our family's financial security evaporate. The man who had worked 16-hour days for 40 years without complaint was suddenly unable to sleep through the night, constantly worried about what new disaster Morrison might inflict on us. His blood pressure rose to dangerous levels, and he developed a persistent cough that the doctor attributed to anxiety and exhaustion. Mama tried to maintain her usual optimistic outlook, but I could see the fear in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. She had always been the family's emotional anchor, the one who kept everyone's spirits up during difficult times. But Morrison's betrayal had shaken her faith in the basic decency of human nature. She stopped talking about the future in her usual, hopeful way, focusing instead on getting through each day without any new catastrophes. The isolation was perhaps the most painful aspect of our ordeal. News of our legal battle with Morrison had spread throughout Millbrook, and while some community members were sympathetic, others seemed to blame us for bringing big city problems into their peaceful town. The local newspaper, which had initially celebrated our partnership with Morrison as a sign of economic progress, now treated the controversy as an embarrassing scandal that reflected poorly on everyone involved. David stood by me throughout this nightmare with unwavering loyalty and support, but I could see that the stress was taking a toll on him as well. His construction business suffered as he spent more and more time helping me deal with legal meetings, document reviews, and the endless complications that Morrison continued to create. The future we had planned together seemed to be slipping away, replaced by an endless cycle of crisis management and damage control. It was during the darkest period of our legal battle that Marcus made his final betrayal, one so calculating and cruel that it destroyed any remaining hope I had of salvaging our relationship. Through Ms. Henderson's investigation, we learned that Marcus had been providing Morrison's attorneys with detailed information about our family's financial situation, our legal strategy, and even private conversations that I had shared with him in confidence. The discovery came when Ms. Henderson noticed that Morrison's legal responses seemed to anticipate our arguments with unusual accuracy, as if they had inside information about our planning process. A careful review of the timing and content of their filings revealed that they were consistently one step ahead of us, in ways that suggested they had access to privileged information about our case. When Ms. Henderson confronted Morrison's attorneys about this possibility, they initially denied any impropriety, but eventually admitted that they had been receiving market intelligence from their employee Marcus about our family's situation. They claimed this was standard business practice and not a violation of any legal or ethical standards, since Marcus was not bound by attorney-client privilege and was free to share information about his own family's circumstances. The revelation that Marcus had been actively working against us while pretending to maintain family loyalty was devastating beyond anything I had previously experienced. It wasn't just that he had chosen his career over his family. He had deliberately undermined our ability to defend ourselves against Morrison's predatory practices. Every private conversation we had shared, every vulnerability I had revealed to him in confidence, had been turned into a weapon against us. When I called Marcus to confront him about this ultimate betrayal, his response was so cold and calculating that I barely recognized his voice. He showed no remorse for his actions, no acknowledgement that he had violated the most basic principles of family loyalty, no concern for the suffering he had caused to people who had loved and supported him throughout his life. "You brought this on yourselves by refusing to adapt to changing business conditions," he told me with chilling detachment. "Morrison offered you opportunities that could have benefited everyone, but you chose to fight instead of working constructively toward solutions. I'm not going to jeopardize my career to protect you from the consequences of your own poor decisions." The conversation ended with me hanging up the phone, knowing that I would never speak to my brother again. The person I had loved most in the world, the one I had trusted with my deepest hopes and fears, had revealed himself to be someone capable of destroying his own family for personal advantage. The betrayal was so complete and so calculated that it left me questioning everything I thought I knew about human nature and family bonds. The final destruction of our dreams came 6 months later, when Morrison Development exercised contractual provisions that allowed them to terminate our partnership agreement due to what they claimed were material breaches of our obligations. The supposed breaches were technical violations of requirements that had been impossible for us to meet, given the resources and timeline that Morrison had provided. But they were sufficient under the contract terms to justify Morrison's withdrawal from the partnership. We lost everything. The land that had been in our family for 3 generations was now owned by Morrison Development, who promptly sold it to another developer for a substantial profit. The general store that Papa had devoted his life to building was closed, its inventory liquidated to pay legal fees and other debts. My dressmaking business was destroyed, its reputation ruined by the chaos and uncertainty of the past year. Papa never recovered from the shock and stress of losing everything he had worked for. He died of a massive heart attack less than 3 months after Morrison terminated our partnership, and I will always believe that the betrayal by his own son was what finally broke his spirit. Mama followed him within the year, her health failing rapidly after losing both her husband and her faith in the fundamental goodness of family relationships. David and I were left with nothing but debt, grief, and the bitter knowledge that we had been destroyed by someone we had trusted completely. The brother who had once promised to protect me had become the architect of my family's destruction, and the damage he had inflicted would take years to repair, if it ever could be repaired at all. The first year after Papa's death was the hardest period of my entire life. David and I had lost everything we owned except for an old pickup truck and the clothes on our backs. We were forced to move into a tiny apartment above the hardware store in Millbrook, surviving on David's sporadic construction work and the charity of neighbors who remembered better times. Every morning I woke up feeling like I was drowning, in grief, anger, and a sense of betrayal so profound that it seemed to poison every breath I took. The worst part wasn't the poverty or the loss of our home, though those were devastating enough. The most unbearable aspect was the knowledge that, Marcus was prospering while we suffered the consequences of his treachery. Through the small-town gossip network, I learned that he had been promoted to a senior position at Morrison Development, apparently rewarded for his success in acquiring our family's property at such favorable terms for the company. The injustice of his reward while we grieved our losses felt like a knife twisting in an already mortal wound. David tried his best to support me through those dark months, but I could see that my bitterness was affecting our marriage in ways that frightened both of us. I would lie awake at night planning elaborate revenge fantasies, imagining ways to expose Marcus's cruelty or destroy his career the way he had destroyed our family. The anger consumed so much of my energy that I had little left for the work of rebuilding our lives or nurturing the love that had brought David and me together. It was Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store who finally forced me to confront what I was becoming. She had watched me deteriorate for months, growing thinner and more withdrawn each week, until one afternoon she sat me down in her back office and spoke to me with the brutal honesty that only old friends can provide. "Janella, honey, you're letting that boy kill you just as surely as if he put poison in your food," she told me bluntly. "Your parents raised a daughter with strength and dignity, but the woman I see now is nothing but bitterness and hate. If you don't find a way to let go of this anger, you're going to lose David too, and then Marcus will have taken everything that ever mattered to you." Her words stung because they were absolutely true. I had become someone I didn't recognize, someone consumed by resentment and thoughts of revenge. The values that Papa and Mama had taught me about forgiveness, resilience, and finding joy in simple blessings had been buried under an avalanche of rage that was destroying me from the inside. That night, for the first time since Papa's funeral, I went to the little Methodist church where David and I had been married. I sat alone in the back pew, surrounded by memories of happier times, and tried to pray for guidance about how to move forward. The words came slowly and painfully, but gradually I began to feel something shift inside me, a small crack in the wall of anger that had surrounded my heart for so long. I didn't experience any dramatic spiritual awakening or sudden revelation. That instantly healed my wounded soul. The process of letting go of my bitterness was slow and difficult, requiring daily choices to focus on gratitude rather than resentment, on building rather than destroying, on love rather than hate. Some days I succeeded, and some days I failed miserably, but gradually I began to reclaim pieces of the person I had been before Marcus's betrayal. David and I made the difficult decision to leave Millbrook and start completely fresh in a place where we wouldn't be constantly reminded of our losses. We had heard about opportunities in Phoenix, Arizona, where the construction industry was booming and skilled carpenters could find steady work. With our meager savings and David's tools loaded into our pickup truck, we headed west toward what we hoped would be a new beginning. Phoenix in 1976 was a city transformed by growth and possibility. The desert landscape was so different from the green fields of Nebraska that it felt like moving to another planet. But there was something healing about the vast open spaces and endless blue skies. David found work immediately with a residential construction company, and his skills and reliability quickly earned him a reputation that led to better opportunities and higher pay. For my part, I struggled initially to find my place in this new environment. My dressmaking skills were still valuable, but the fashion preferences and lifestyle demands of Phoenix were very different from what I had known in small-town Nebraska. It took months of experimentation and adaptation before I began to understand what my new customers wanted and how to provide it effectively. The breakthrough came when I started working with Maria Gonzalez, an elderly Mexican woman who ran a small alteration shop in a Hispanic neighborhood near downtown Phoenix. Maria took me under her wing despite our language barriers, teaching me techniques and styles that I had never encountered before. Her generosity and patience reminded me that not everyone in the world was motivated by greed and selfishness, and her friendship became the foundation for rebuilding my faith in human goodness. Working alongside Maria, I learned to create clothing that reflected the vibrant culture and practical needs of Phoenix's diverse population. The intricate embroidery and colorful fabrics that were popular in the Hispanic community challenged me to develop new skills and stretch my creative abilities in directions I had never explored. The work was satisfying in ways that went beyond mere income, reconnecting me with the joy of creating beautiful things that made people feel special. As my skills and reputation grew, I began to envision opening my own shop again, but this time with a clearer understanding of what I wanted to achieve. Instead of focusing primarily on profit maximization, I wanted to create a business that served my community while also providing personal fulfillment. The lessons I had learned from Marcus's betrayal had taught me to value integrity and authentic relationships over financial success at any cost. David and I saved every penny we could spare, living frugally in a small apartment and avoiding any unnecessary expenses. By 1978, we had accumulated enough capital to lease a small storefront in a growing suburban area where young families were building new homes and establishing new lives. Desert Rose alterations and custom clothing became our joint venture, with David handling the construction and maintenance aspects while I focused on the creative and customer service elements. The business grew steadily but organically, built on word-of-mouth recommendations and repeat customers rather than aggressive marketing or expansion plans. I specialized in creating custom garments for special occasions, alterations that transformed ill-fitting clothes into perfect fits, and repairs that extended the life of cherished garments. Each project was approached with the same attention to detail and commitment to quality that Papa had taught me was the foundation of any honest business. Our first real test came in 1980, when a larger chain store opened nearby and began offering alteration services at prices I couldn't match. Several of my customers were attracted by the convenience and lower costs, and for a few months, I worried that we might lose everything we had worked so hard to build. The situation reminded me uncomfortably of the Morrison development crisis, triggering old fears about trusting people and making myself vulnerable to betrayal. But this time, the outcome was different. The customers who had been tempted by the chain store's lower prices gradually returned, complaining about poor workmanship and impersonal service. They had learned the same lesson I had learned in Nebraska, that the cheapest option is rarely the best value, and that relationships built on mutual respect and genuine care are worth more than transactions based solely on price. By 1982, Desert Rose had become profitable enough to support David and me comfortably, and we began to think seriously about starting a family. The idea of bringing children into the world had seemed impossible during the darkest periods after Papa's death, when I could barely take care of myself, much less nurture new life. But the healing process had restored my faith in the possibility of goodness and joy, making parenthood feel like a natural next step rather than an overwhelming responsibility. Our daughter Sarah was born in the spring of 1983, followed by Michael in 1985 and Tommy in 1987. Becoming a mother transformed my understanding of love, forgiveness, and the importance of breaking cycles of pain and betrayal. I was determined that my children would grow up understanding that family loyalty was precious, but not unconditional, that trust must be earned through actions rather than assumed because of blood relationships. The children brought a lightness and purpose to our lives that I had thought was lost forever. Watching them explore the world with wonder and enthusiasm reminded me daily of the beauty that still existed despite the cruelties I had experienced. Their laughter filled our home with joy that no amount of money or success could have purchased, and their innocent questions about life and relationships forced me to articulate the values I wanted to pass on to the next generation. As the years passed and our family business continued to thrive, I occasionally heard news about Marcus through mutual acquaintances or business contacts. He had indeed prospered with Morrison Development, eventually becoming a regional vice president responsible for rural acquisitions throughout the Midwest. His success came at the cost of many other families like ours, small-town businesses that were systematically exploited and destroyed to feed corporate profits. The news of his professional achievements no longer triggered the intense anger and resentment that had once consumed me. Instead, I felt a profound sadness for the person he had chosen to become, and gratitude for the different path that David and I had taken. Marcus had gained wealth and status by sacrificing his integrity and his family relationships, while we had found prosperity through honest work and authentic connections with our community. In 1995, when I was 44 and Sarah was preparing to graduate from high school, I received an unexpected phone call that would provide closure to the most painful chapter of my life. The caller identified himself as an attorney representing Morrison Development, which was apparently facing a major lawsuit related to their business practices in rural acquisitions. The attorney explained that several former Morrison employees, including some who had participated in the company's predatory schemes, were cooperating with investigators in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Marcus was apparently among those providing testimony about the company's systematic fraud, and the attorney wondered if our family might be interested in joining a class action lawsuit seeking compensation for victims of Morrison's practices. The opportunity for legal vindication and financial recovery was tempting, but it would also require revisiting all the painful memories and complicated emotions that I had worked so hard to resolve. After discussing the situation with David, I decided that our energy was better spent on building our future rather than seeking justice for our past. We had created a good life despite Marcus's betrayal, and I didn't want to risk disturbing the peace we had found by reopening old wounds. The last I heard of Marcus came through a brief newspaper article about the Morrison Development scandal that a friend sent me in 1996. He had apparently been terminated from the company when the full extent of their fraudulent practices became public, and he was facing potential criminal charges related to his role in the scheme. The article mentioned that he had filed for bankruptcy and was reportedly seeking employment in another industry. I felt no satisfaction in learning about his downfall, only a deep sadness for the choices that had led him so far from the values we had been raised with. The brother I had once loved was long gone, replaced by someone whose pursuit of success had cost him everything that truly mattered. His fate served as a constant reminder of the importance of staying true to the principles that Papa and Mama had taught us, regardless of the temptations that life might present. Today, at 74, I look back on that terrible period of betrayal and loss as a painful but necessary part of my journey toward wisdom and authentic happiness. The lessons I learned about the difference between love and manipulation, between family loyalty and blind trust, between success and prosperity, have served me well in every relationship and decision since then. My children are grown now, with families of their own, and I am blessed with grandchildren who remind me daily of the possibility for goodness and joy in this world. David and I retired from active management of Desert Rose several years ago, though we still help out occasionally when the new owners need advice or assistance. Our life in Savannah, Georgia, where we moved to be closer to Sarah's family, is quiet and peaceful, filled with simple pleasures that would have seemed impossible during those dark days after Papa's death. The pain of Marcus's betrayal will always be part of my story, but it no longer defines who I am or limits what I believe is possible. I have learned that healing doesn't require forgetting or forgiving those who have hurt us, but it does require choosing to focus our energy on love rather than hate, on building rather than destroying, on hope rather than despair. To anyone who might be struggling with betrayal by someone they trusted completely, I want you to know that the wounds can heal, even when they seem too deep to survive. The process is slow and difficult, and there will be days when the pain feels unbearable. But on the other side of that darkness is the possibility of a life richer and more meaningful than you ever imagined possible. The brother who betrayed me took many things from our family, but he could not take our capacity for love, our ability to create beauty, or our determination to live with integrity. Those gifts remain with us always, waiting to be rediscovered. Whenever we find the courage to choose hope over bitterness, Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.